The first time Louisa Keene fired a rifle after the fever took her sight, she put a bullet through her own smokehouse door and nearly killed the rooster. That was the spring of 1878, in the high country of Wyoming territory, where the wind came down off the bighorn smelling of pine and snow even in June. Louisa was 26 years old, and she had been blind for 11 months, ever since the scarlet fever burned through her body and left her world in permanent twilight, shapes and shadows, where there had once been sunrises over her father's cattle. Her father was 2 years in the ground by then, and her mother had died birthing her, so the ranch was hers alone, 600 acres of grazing land and a herd that dwindled every season because a blind woman could not chase off rustlers, could not track a mountain lion prowling for calves, could not even see well enough to mend her own fences without cutting her hands to ribbons on the wire. She stood now in the yard with her father's old Winchester heavy in her hands, smoke still curling from the barrel, and she wanted to weep from the frustration of it. But she had done enough weeping in the first months of her blindness to last a lifetime, and she had promised herself she would not do it again over something so small as a missed shot. "You are aiming with your eyes," said a voice from the fence line, low and unhurried, "which is a peculiar thing to do, seeing as you do not have the use of them." Louisa's spine went straight as a fence post. She had not heard anyone ride up, had not heard hoofbeats or a horse blowing or a saddle creaking, and that alone told her something about the stranger's care in approaching a place with a rifle-wielding woman standing in the yard. "Who is that?" she called out, and she was proud that her voice did not shake, though her hands had gone tight around the stock of the gun. "Name is Ira Blackwell," the voice said. "I am not armed, and I mean you no harm, ma'am. I saw the shot go wide from the road and thought I might offer some advice, if you are willing to hear it from a stranger." "I do not need advice from a man who cannot even announce himself proper before speaking," Louisa said, though she lowered the rifle's muzzle toward the dirt. "My apologies. I have been riding since before dawn and my manners are somewhere back in Cheyenne with my good hat." There was a faint note of humor in his voice, low and warm, the kind of voice that had seen hard years but had not let them curdle him entirely. "I will state my business plain. I am a drifter, ma'am, no more and no less. I go where there is work, and I move on when there is not. I saw your rooster nearly meet his maker, and I thought perhaps you could use a hand around a place this size." Louisa turned her face toward the sound of him, and though she could not see his features, she could hear the particular quality of a man standing easy, unthreatened, patient. "I cannot pay a hired man much," she said. "The ranch has been going down since I lost my sight, and before that since my father died. I have maybe 11 head of cattle left that have not wandered off or been taken, and a garden that needs weeding, and a roof that leaks when it rains proper. I do not need much," Ira Blackwell said. "Board and meals will serve, and whatever wage you can spare when the season turns and you sell what stock you have." "You would work a blind woman's ranch for room and board alone," Louisa said, skepticism thick in her voice. "Why would a man do such a thing?" There was a pause before he answered, long enough that Louisa wondered if he was deciding how much truth to give her. "Because I have done a great many things in my life that I am not proud of, Miss Keene, and helping put food on an honest table seems as good a place as any to start making some kind of accounting for that." She did not know his full history then, would not know it for weeks, but something in the plain honesty of his answer settled something in her chest that had been coiled tight since her father's funeral. "How do you know my name?" "The mailbox at the end of your lane. Kene burned into the wood." Another pause. "I confess I have been standing here a full minute working up the nerve to speak. You looked like a woman who did not want interrupting." Louisa almost smiled despite herself. "You may stay the night in the barn, Mr. Blackwell, and we will see in the morning whether you are worth your salt or whether you are a liar and a thief who will make off with my silver, of which I have very little to steal." "Fair enough, ma'am." "Fair enough." That was how Ira Blackwell came to the Keene Ranch, on a Tuesday in late June of 1878, and though neither of them knew it yet, it was the day that would change the whole shape of both their lives. Ira Blackwell was 31 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who have gone hungry more than once and never quite filled back out, with sandy hair going a shade darker at the temples and a face weathered by wind and sun into something older than his years, though his eyes, had Louisa been able to see them, were a startling clear gray, the color of rain clouds before a storm breaks. He had ridden out of Missouri at 17 after his father died in a mine collapse, had scouted for the army for a spell, had punched cattle in Texas, had done other things too, things he did not speak of even to himself if he could help it, things involving a gun and money changing hands and men who did not walk away from the transaction. He had come west a dozen times over the years, always moving, never settling, because settling meant putting down roots, and roots meant someone could find you, and there were people in his past he did not wish to be found by. He had been riding north out of Cheyenne with no particular destination in mind, when he saw the rooster nearly die, and the woman standing in the yard with a rifle, and a face turned toward the sound of her own failure, and something about her straight back and her stubborn chin had made him stop his horse before his mind had finished deciding to do so. That first night he slept in the barn on a bed of straw, and in the morning he was up before Louisa, though she was up early herself, and he found the milking done and the chickens fed and the wood stacked by the stove, and when Louisa came out onto the porch, feeling her way along the rail as she had trained herself to do, she found the smell of coffee already in the air. "You did not have to do all that this morning," she said, though there was a warmth creeping into her voice she had not intended to let through. "A man who eats another's food should earn it before he sits down to the table," Ira said. "That was my mother's teaching, God rest her." They ate breakfast together on the porch, eggs and bread and the strong black coffee Ira had made, and Louisa found herself telling him about the ranch, about her father Thomas Keene, who had built it up from nothing after coming west in the 50s, about the cattle that kept disappearing, about the neighboring rancher, a hard man named Silas Roan, who had made 2 offers to buy her land in the past year, offers she suspected were not entirely separate from the cattle that kept vanishing. "You think this Roan is behind the rustling," Ira said. "It was not quite a question. I cannot prove it. I cannot see his face when he speaks to me, cannot see if he smiles when he offers me half what the land is worth. But I have ears, Mr. Blackwell, and my ears tell me a great deal that my eyes once did not bother to notice. Such as the fact that his voice changes when he lies. It gets a mite higher, a mite quicker. And when he came here in March offering to buy me out, his voice did that very thing when he said he was sorry for my troubles." Ira was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Then your ears are worth more than most men's eyes, Miss Keene. Do not flatter me, Mr. Blackwell. I have had enough of that from men who think a blind woman is easy pickings for either land or worse." "I am not flattering you," Ira said, and something in his tone made her believe him. "I have known men who could see a bird on a branch 100 yards off and could not tell you a single true thing about the man standing in front of them. Seeing and understanding are not the same trade." Louisa turned her face toward him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and though she could not see the way he was looking at her, she felt the weight of his attention like sunlight, and it made her uncomfortable in a way she was not prepared to examine too closely. Not yet. Not on the first morning of knowing a man's name. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Ira mended fences and rebuilt the smokehouse door Louisa had shot through, and he learned the herd, what few cattle remained, learned their markings and their habits, learned the lay of the land, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the stand of cottonwoods where the deer liked to bed down, the low ridge to the north where a man could see clear to the roan spread if he had a mind to watch it. And Louisa, for her part, began to trust the sound of his footsteps, the particular scrape of his boot heel that was different from anyone else's, the way he always spoke a word of warning before he touched anything of hers so as not to startle her, a courtesy she had not realized she craved until she received it. It was on the 5th day that Ira first raised the subject of the rifle. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, the sun going down somewhere behind the mountains that Louisa could not see but could feel in the cooling of the air. And Ira had been quiet for some time, turning something over in his mind when he said, "I have been thinking about your rifle." "Have you?" Louisa said, not quite a question, guarded because she did not enjoy the reminder of her failures. "You cannot see to aim. That much is plain. But you have ears sharper than any man I have known, and I have known men who could hear a rattlesnake's tongue flick from 30 feet. What are you proposing, Mr. Blackwell?" "I am proposing that a gun does not need eyes to find its mark, Miss Keene. It needs a steady hand and a knowledge of where the sound is coming from, and those two things you can learn, same as any man learns to shoot true. I have taught men to shoot before in the army, greenhorns who had never held a rifle in their lives. I believe I could teach you to shoot by sound alone, if you are willing to try, and willing to fail a good many times before you succeed." Louisa sat with this for a long moment. Pride told her to refuse, to say she did not need a stranger's charity added to the charity of his labor. But beneath the pride was something else, a hunger she had not let herself feel since the fever took her sight, a hunger to be capable again, to be more than a woman who needed protecting, to be someone who could stand in her own yard and defend her own land against men like Silas Roan, who circled her ranch like buzzards waiting for her to fail. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, echoing the question she had asked on the first day, but meaning something different by it now. Ira did not answer right away. When he did, his voice had a rough edge to it that had not been there before. "Because I have watched you these 5 days, Miss Keene, doing the work of 2 hands with the courage of 10 men, and it does not sit right with me that you should have to depend on luck or on a hired man's presence to keep what is rightfully yours. A woman like you ought to be able to stand her own ground." "A woman like me," Louisa repeated softly. "A woman who does not quit," Ira said. "I have not known many like that." The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Ira led Louisa out to the field behind the barn, where he had set up a row of tin cans on a fence rail the evening before, and he began to teach her. "The first thing you must understand," he said, "is that sound has a shape, same as a thing you could touch with your hands. When I speak to you now, you know I am standing to your left, some 10 feet off, because the sound reaches your left ear a hair before it reaches your right, and your mind has already done the reckoning of where I stand without you asking it to." "I had not thought of it in such terms," Louisa admitted, "but I suppose that is true. Now I want you to forget the cans for a moment. I am going to walk around you in a circle, and I want you to point at me with your finger, not the rifle, just your hand, and tell me when you believe I am standing directly in front of you, then directly behind, then to each side." They practiced this for the better part of an hour, Ira circling her slowly at first and then more quickly, sometimes stepping softly to test her, sometimes deliberately loud, and Louisa found that her accuracy improved with each pass, her body learning a new language that her eyes could no longer speak for her. "You are a quick study," Ira said, admiration plain in his voice. "I have had little else to do these 11 months but listen," Louisa said. "I suppose the listening was building towards something, even if I did not know it." By the end of the first week, they moved from pointing to the actual rifle, though Ira insisted on starting with an empty weapon, having Louisa practice raising it, sighting by ear toward the sound of his voice or a thrown stone, squeezing the trigger on an empty chamber so she could feel the mechanics of it without the fear of the noise or the recoil. "A gun is a tool," he told her, "same as a plow or a needle and thread. It only frightens those who do not understand it. Once you understand it, it becomes an extension of your own hand, and there is nothing frightening about your own hand, is there?" "There was a time my own hands frightened me," Louisa said quietly, "in the early months when I could not tell where they ended and the dark began." Ira did not respond to this with false comfort or empty reassurance, which Louisa had come to appreciate about him. Instead he said, "That must have been a lonesome thing to carry." It was, Louisa said, and found to her surprise that she was blinking back tears, not from grief but from the simple relief of being understood without having to explain herself twice. 2 weeks into his stay, Ira had Louisa shooting at Kens hung from strings, Kens that he would set swinging and striking together to create sound. And though she missed more often than she hit in those early days, there came an afternoon in mid-July when she raised the Winchester at the sound of two Kens clinking together 40 feet distant, and fired, and heard the satisfying clang of metal struck true, the Ken leaping on its string and spinning away. "I hit it," she said, disbelief and joy warring in her voice. "Ira, I hit it." "You did," Ira said, and there was something in the way he said her Christian name, the first time he had used it rather than the formal Miss Keene, that made Louisa's heart do a strange small flip in her chest. "I told you that you would." "Say that again," Louisa said. "You would." "No, my name. Say my name again." There was a pause, and then Ira said, softly, "Louisa," and the words seemed to hang in the summer air between them like something fragile and precious, and neither of them moved to break the silence that followed for a long moment. "Ira," she said back, testing the shape of his name in her own mouth, and something passed between them then, unspoken but deeply felt, a recognition that whatever this was, whatever was growing in the space between a blind rancher and a drifter with a hidden past, it was no longer merely a matter of wages and chores. It was in the 3rd week of Ira's stay that Sela's roan came calling again. Louisa heard the horse before she heard the man, a heavy gelding by the sound of its gait, moving at an unhurried walk up the lane, and she was in the garden with her hands in the dirt, feeling for weeds among her bean plants, when Ira's voice came low and warning from the porch. "Louisa, a rider is coming. I believe it is roan from the look of the horse." Louisa stood, brushing the dirt from her skirts, and felt for the edge of the garden fence to orient herself before making her way toward the sound of Ira's voice. By the time she reached the porch, the hoofbeats had stopped in the yard, and she could hear the creak of saddle leather as a man dismounted. "Miss Keene," came the voice she remembered, smooth and a little too pleasant, like molasses poured over something gone sour beneath. "I see you have taken on some help." "Mr. Roan," Louisa said, keeping her own voice cool and even. "This is Ira Blackwell. He has been assisting me around the ranch." "Has he?" Roan said, and Louisa heard the small shift in his tone, an appraisal being made, a calculation. "Well, I had hoped we might speak privately about my offer." "There is nothing to speak of privately that Mr. Blackwell cannot hear," Louisa said. "My answer remains the same as it was in March, and the same as it will be next spring should you ask again. This ranch is not for sale. Miss Keene, be reasonable. A woman alone in your condition cannot hope to hold 600 acres against the troubles that come with ranching in this territory. Cattle wander, fences fall, winters are hard. I am offering you a fair price and a chance to live out your years in comfort in town, rather than struggling here until the land takes what little you have left. My condition, as you call it, has not stopped me from knowing exactly how many head of cattle I lost this spring, Mr. Roan, nor from noticing that the tracks leading away from my northern pasture in April led in the direction of your land." There was a silence then, brief but telling, and when Roan spoke again his voice had climbed half a register, quick and defensive, the very tell Louisa had described to Ira days before. "I do not know what you are implying, Miss Keene, but I would be careful with accusations you cannot prove." "I have made no accusation, Mr. Roan," Louisa said sweetly. "I have only observed a fact regarding the direction of tracks. You may draw whatever conclusions you like from that observation." Ira had said nothing throughout this exchange, standing at Louisa's side on the porch, but Louisa could feel the tension radiating off him, coiled and watchful, and she suspected that had Roan made any move toward threat, Ira would have been between them before she could draw breath to object. "I will take my leave," Roan said finally, his pleasant tone restored with obvious effort. "But my offer stands until the fall roundup, Miss Keene. After that, I cannot guarantee the price will remain so generous." They listened to him mount and ride away, the hoofbeats fading down the lane, and only when the sound had died away entirely did Ira speak. "You handled that like a woman who has faced down worse than a greedy neighbor," he said, and there was pride in his voice, unmistakable pride and something warmer beneath it. "I have had to learn a great many things this past year," Louisa said, "patience with fools chief among them. I do not think patience is quite the word for what I just witnessed." That was closer to a rattlesnake, letting a man know exactly how far he could step before getting bit. Louisa laughed then, a genuine laugh that surprised her with its suddenness, and Ira laughed with her, and for a moment the shadow of Silas Roan's visit lifted entirely from the yard. But that night, after Louisa had gone to bed, Ira sat alone on the porch steps with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, thinking about the way Roan's men had watched him from the road as they rode past earlier that week. 3 riders who had slowed their horses, just enough to take a long look at the Keene ranch and the stranger working its fences. He thought about the tracks Louisa had mentioned, and about the particular kind of man who would try to starve a blind woman off her own land rather than face her honestly. And he thought, too, about the life he had left behind in Kansas and Missouri and points further east, the men who might still be looking for him on account of a debt collector who had not survived their disagreement 6 years past, a thing that had been self-defense in truth but would not look that way to a judge. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether his presence here was doing Louisa Keene more harm than good, whether the trouble that seemed to follow him like a shadow might yet catch up to her too. But when he thought of leaving, of saddling his horse in the gray hour before dawn and riding on as he had ridden on from a dozen other places, something in his chest rebelled against the idea with a force that surprised him. He had not felt this way about a place, or a person, in longer than he cared to remember. He realized with something like dread and something like joy tangled together, falling in love with Louisa Keene, and he did not know what in the world he was going to do about it. August came on hot and dry, and the shooting lessons continued in the mornings before the heat grew too fierce, and Louisa's skill grew with each passing week until she could hit a swinging can 8 times in 10, and then a thrown stone in flight more often than not, her ear having grown so attuned to the small sounds of the world around her that she began to notice things even Ira, with his sighted eyes, missed. She heard the particular whistle of wind through a loose board on the barn roof 3 days before Ira noticed the board had come loose. She heard a rattlesnake's warning from 20 feet off in the tall grass and called out to Ira before he came within striking distance, saving him, quite possibly, from a bite that could have proven fatal so far from a doctor. "You have got sharper hearing than any man I ever scouted with," Ira told her one evening, genuine astonishment in his voice, "and I scouted with crow trackers who could hear a deer breathing from 50 yards. I have had to make my ears do the work my eyes once did," Louisa said simply. "A person can grow accustomed to nearly anything, given enough time and enough reason." It was during these long weeks that Louisa learned more of Ira's history, drawn out slowly, in pieces offered when the evening light was soft and the day's work was done, and both of them were tired enough to let their guards down. She learned about his father, killed in a mine collapse in Missouri when Ira was 17, and about the years of drifting that followed, scouting for the army in the territories, punching cattle on the long drives up from Texas. And she learned, though it took the longest to come out, about the debt collector in Missouri, a man named Cyrus Vance, who had come to collect on a debt Ira's late father had left unpaid, and who had drawn a pistol on Ira in a dispute over the terms, and who had died in the alley behind a saloon in a town Ira would not name, from a wound that came, Ira swore, only after Vance fired first and missed. "I never meant to kill him," Ira said, his voice low and rough with old shame, on the night he finally told her the full story. They were sitting on the porch, the crickets loud in the summer dark, and Louisa had reached out without quite meaning to and found his hand resting on the step between them, and had left her own hand there, covering his. But he was dead all the same, and I knew the law in that county would not look kindly on a young drifter's word against a respectable collector's family, so I ran. I have been running near enough ever since." "You do not seem like a man who ran from cowardice," Louisa said softly. "I do not know what I ran from exactly. Fear of the noose, I suppose, fear of dying for something that felt like it was not entirely my fault, though I have turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since, and I still am not certain where the fault truly lay." "Do you believe you deserve to die for defending yourself?" "No," Ira said, "but I am not certain the law would have agreed with me." "Then perhaps the law was wrong," Louisa said, "and you were right to preserve your own life. A man is not obligated to lay down and die simply because the person threatening him has more standing in town." Ira turned his face toward her in the dark, and though she could not see the expression there, she felt the weight of his attention, felt something shift in the air between them, and when he spoke his voice had gone rough in an entirely different way. "You are a remarkable woman, Louisa Keene." "I am only a woman who has learned to see past the surface of things, Ira Blackwell, on account of not having any other choice in the matter." He turned his hand beneath hers then, so that their palms met and their fingers laced together, and neither of them spoke for a long while after that, content simply to sit together in the warm dark, listening to the crickets and the distant call of a night bird and the steady, comforting rhythm of each other's breathing. It was 3 days later that the real trouble began. Louisa woke before dawn to the sound of cattle bawling in distress, a sound she had come to know well enough over the months to recognize as fear rather than mere restlessness, and she was out of bed and dressing before she had fully processed what had woken her. By the time she made it to the porch, Ira was already there, rifle in hand, having heard the same commotion. "Rustlers," he said grimly. "In the north pasture by the sound of it. I am going to ride out." "I am coming with you," Louisa said. "Louisa, it is not safe. I do not know how many men we are dealing with, and in the dark, Ira Blackwell, I am no more disadvantaged than you are, and considerably better armed with the ears God gave me. I have been practicing for 2 months for exactly this kind of night. Do not tell me to stay behind now." There was a pause, and Louisa could hear the internal war Ira was fighting, the protective instinct warring with the respect he had come to have for her judgment and her hard-won skill. "All right," he said finally, "but you stay close to me, and you do exactly as I say the moment I say it. This is not a tin can on a string, Louisa. Men who rustle cattle are not above shooting at whoever comes to stop them." "I understand." They saddled their horses quickly, Ira guiding Louisa's hand to the reins and describing the terrain in low, quick words as they rode, and within 15 minutes they had reached the edge of the north pasture, where the sound of frightened cattle was louder now, mixed with the low voices of men, and the creak of a gate being forced open. "3 of them, I think," Ira murmured, close to Louisa's ear, having dismounted and drawn her down beside him behind a stand of scrub brush. "Driving a dozen head toward the gap in the fence line." "I hear 4, Louisa said quietly. "There is a 4th voice further back, quieter, giving orders." Ira listened again, straining his ears, and after a moment he nodded, though he remembered belatedly that Louisa could not see the gesture, and murmured, "You are right. I believe that is Roan himself, come to oversee his own thieving this time." "Shall we announce ourselves?" "Carefully," Ira said. "I do not want gunplay if we can avoid it, but I will not let them drive off what cattle you have left either." They moved forward together, Ira's hand light on Louisa's elbow to guide her over the uneven ground, until they were close enough to see, in Ira's case, and to hear with perfect clarity in Louisa's, the shapes of 3 riders pushing cattle through a gap cut in the fence, while a 4th man sat his horse some distance off, directing the operation in low tones. "That is far enough," Ira called out, leveling his rifle. "Roan, I know that is you sitting back there like a general too proud to fight his own battles. Call your men off, or there is going to be trouble here tonight that none of us will walk away from clean." There was a moment of frozen silence, and then Roan's voice came, sharp with surprise and quickly masked anger. Blackwell, I did not expect a hired hand to have such nerve. I am not a hired hand tonight, Roan. Tonight I am a man standing beside a woman defending what is rightfully hers, and that is a different animal entirely from a man punching cattle for wages. You are outnumbered 4-2, Roan said, though Louisa noted with some satisfaction that his voice had climbed into that telltale higher register. 4-2, perhaps, Louisa called out, stepping forward beside Ira, her rifle raised and steady. But only one of us needs eyes to know exactly where each of your men is standing, Mr. Roan, and I assure you, mine are working fine tonight. This was, in fact, true. In the darkness, with the moon only a thin crescent overhead, sight was of limited use to anyone, but sound carried perfectly, and Louisa had spent 2 months training her ears for precisely this kind of night. She could hear each of Roan's 3 riders clearly, could triangulate their positions with an accuracy that made Ira's estimation, done by straining his eyes in poor light, seem almost clumsy by comparison. "This is madness," one of Roan's men muttered, loud enough for Louisa to hear. "The woman is blind, Roan. She cannot possibly—" "She can," Ira said, cold and certain. "I have trained her myself these past months, and I promise you, gentlemen, she has become a finer shot than any of you on account of not needing her eyes to do it. Test her if you doubt me, and see how that turns out for whichever of you draws first." There was an uneasy silence, and Louisa could hear the shifting of horses, the creak of saddle leather as men reconsidered their positions, weighing the odds against a claim they could not verify but did not wish to test either. "Roan," Louisa called out, her voice steady and clear in the night air, "you have taken enough from me. My cattle, my peace of mind, nearly my land itself through your endless offers dressed up as neighborly concern. I will not have my cattle taken tonight as well. Call your men off and ride home, and let us speak no more of this, or I promise you I will put a bullet through whichever of your men moves first, and I will not miss." For a long moment, nothing happened, and Louisa's heart hammered in her chest, uncertain whether her bluff, if it could even be called a bluff given the months of genuine practice behind it, would hold. Then one of Roan's men, the one who had questioned her ability, shifted in his saddle with a creak of leather, perhaps simply to ease a cramped leg, perhaps testing her claim, and Louisa, hearing the sound and reading it in an instant as movement toward a weapon, raised her rifle and fired a single shot that clipped the man's hat clean off his head without touching a hair beneath it. The silence that followed was absolute. "Next one will not be so generous," Louisa said, her voice not even trembling though her heart was pounding fit to burst from her chest. "Ride home, Mr. Roan. This conversation is finished." There was a scramble of movement then, horses wheeling, men muttering curses under their breath, and within moments the sound of hoofbeats was receding into the darkness, Roan and his 3 men riding hard back toward their own land, leaving the dozen head of cattle milling in confusion near the broken fence. Ira let out a breath he had clearly been holding for some time, and when he spoke his voice was thick with an emotion Louisa could not immediately name. "Louisa, that was the finest shot I have ever seen fired, in daylight or dark, by a man with 2 good eyes or otherwise." "I was aiming for his hat," Louisa said, and only now did her hands begin to shake, the reality of what she had just done. What could have happened had her aim been even slightly off, catching up to her all at once? "I was aiming for his hat, Ira, but I could have hit him, could have killed a man tonight." And Ira was beside her in an instant, his rifle set aside, his arms coming around her before either of them had quite decided that this was the appropriate response, and Louisa found herself pressed against his chest, shaking, while he held her steady. "You did exactly what needed doing," Ira murmured into her hair, "and you did not kill anyone, and you saved your own cattle and very likely saved us both a great deal of trouble besides. You have nothing to be ashamed of tonight, Louisa, nothing at all." "I was so frightened," she admitted, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Not of them exactly, but of failing, of you being hurt because I could not trust my own ears when it mattered most." "You trusted them exactly right," Ira said. You always have." They stood together in the dark pasture for a long moment, the recovered cattle lowing softly around them, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining away and leaving something else in its place, something that had been building between them for 2 months and could no longer be denied or set aside for later. Louisa lifted her face from his chest, and Ira, without quite deciding to do so, found his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "Louisa," he said softly, "I have fallen in love with you. I have been trying to tell myself otherwise for weeks now, telling myself it was foolish, that a drifter with my history has no business falling in love with a woman who deserves so much better than what I could offer her, but I cannot pretend any longer. I love you, and I do not know what to do about it except to tell you the truth of it and let you decide what you will." Louisa's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she could not speak at all, overwhelmed by the sudden nakedness of his confession, the vulnerability in his voice that she had never heard there before, not even when he had told her about Cyrus Vance and the debt that had made him a fugitive. "Ira," she finally said, "I have been falling in love with you since the second week you were here, when you taught me to hit that first can, and said my name for the first time as though it were something precious. I have been telling myself it was foolish too, that I have no business asking a man to stay tied to a blind woman and a struggling ranch when he could go anywhere, be anything, but I cannot pretend any longer either. I love you too." The kiss that followed was soft at first, tentative, as though both of them were afraid the moment might shatter if handled too roughly, but it deepened quickly into something more certain, more sure. 2 months of unspoken longing finding voice at last in the quiet dark of the north pasture, surrounded by the very cattle they had just saved together. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing softly, giddy with the release of tension and the joy of a confession long overdue. "We ought to get these cattle back where they belong," Ira said, though he made no move to release Louisa from his arms. "In a moment," Louisa said, "kiss me again first." He did. They rode home in the gray light before dawn, the recovered cattle driven ahead of them, and though the danger of the night was past, both of them understood that the confrontation with Roan was far from truly finished. A man like Silas Roan, humiliated in front of his own hired men by a blind woman's marksmanship, was not a man likely to simply accept defeat and move along. Over the following days, this suspicion proved well-founded. Word traveled fast in the small ranching community around the town of Sweetwater, and within a week the story of Louisa Keene's shot, the blind rancher who had put a bullet through a rustler's hat by sound alone, had spread across the territory, told and retold in the saloon and the general store and the church social, growing more dramatic with each telling, until some versions had her shooting 3 men dead in the dark rather than merely clipping a single hat. The reaction in town was mixed. Some, particularly the women, saw in Louisa's story a kind of vindication, proof that a woman need not be helpless simply because fate had dealt her a hard blow, and several came to call at the ranch in the weeks that followed, bringing baskets of preserves and offers of friendship that Louisa had not received since before her blindness, when people had perhaps assumed she needed no charity and therefore offered none. Others, particularly those men who did business with Roan or feared his influence in local matters, muttered that a woman with a rifle and no eyes to guide it was an unnatural thing, dangerous even, and that the drifter who had taught her ought to be run out of the territory for encouraging such foolishness. Roan himself said nothing publicly, made no move against Louisa or Ira in the weeks that followed, and this silence worried Ira more than any open threat might have. "A man like Roan does not simply accept a public humiliation and move along," he told Louisa one evening in September as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set, or rather, as Ira watched it and described the colors to Louisa in low, warm tones, a habit that had become one of the tender rituals of their courtship. "He is planning something. I can feel it in my bones. What do you think he will do? I do not know, but I think we ought to be ready for anything." Ira's instincts proved correct within the month. It was early October, the aspens turning gold in the high country and the nights growing sharp with the first hint of the coming winter, when a rider came from town with news that changed the shape of their carefully guarded happiness. The rider was a boy of perhaps 16, the son of the town's blacksmith, and he brought word that a stranger had arrived in Sweetwater asking questions about a man named Ira Blackwell, a stranger who wore a deputy's badge from a county in Missouri and who had shown around a paper with Ira's likeness drawn on it, a wanted notice for the killing of one Cyrus Vance, 6 years past. Ira went pale as he heard this news, and Louisa, though she could not see his face, heard the sudden stillness in his body, the held breath, and understood immediately what it meant. "They have found me," Ira said quietly, once the boy had ridden off with a coin for his trouble and a promise to say nothing of having delivered the message. "Louisa, I have to leave. If that deputy finds me here, he will arrest me, and there is every chance a Missouri court would hang me for what happened, regardless of the truth of it. I cannot let that touch you. I cannot let you be tangled up in this." "No," Louisa said, and there was iron in her voice that surprised even herself. "I will not let you run, Ira Blackwell, not from this. We will face it together or not at all. Louisa, be reasonable. This is not a matter of pride or courage. This is my life at stake, and if I stay and am found here, it could put you in danger too, accused of harboring a fugitive, and I will not have that on my conscience along with everything else." "Then we will not hide you," Louisa said. "We will clear your name instead. You have told me the truth of what happened with Cyrus Vance, that he drew first, that you acted only in defense of your own life. If that is true, Ira, and I believe with my whole heart that it is, then there must be some way to prove it, some way to face this deputy and this Missouri court with the truth rather than running from it forever." "There were no witnesses," Ira said, despair creeping into his voice. "It happened in an alley at night. There is no one to speak for what truly happened save myself, and my word alone will not be enough against a respectable family's grief and anger." Louisa was quiet for a moment, thinking, and then she said slowly, "You said Vance was a debt collector. Do you know if he had done this kind of thing before, threatened men over debts with violence rather than legal recourse?" "I believe so. There were rumors even then that he had roughed up other debtors who could not pay on time. Then perhaps there are others who would testify to his character if someone were to seek them out. A pattern of violence on his part would lend credence to your claim of self-defense, even without an eyewitness to the specific event." Ira stared at her, something like hope kindling in his chest for the first time since the news had arrived. "You would do that? Help me build a defense rather than simply telling me to run?" "I love you, Ira Blackwell," Louisa said simply. "I did not fall in love with a man who runs from his troubles. I fell in love with a man who taught a blind woman to shoot by sound alone because he believed she deserved to stand her own ground. I will not ask any less of myself now, when it is your ground that needs defending." They spent that night making plans, and in the morning, rather than fleeing, Ira rode into Sweetwater to face the deputy directly, with Louisa at his side, both of them understanding the risk but neither willing to consider any other course. The deputy, a weathered man named Garrett Holt, was found at the town's single hotel, and when Ira approached him openly, identifying himself without hesitation, the deputy's surprise was evident. "Most men in your position would have run," Holt said, studying Ira with narrowed eyes. "I have run enough these past 6 years," Ira said. "I am tired of it, deputy. I did kill Cyrus Vance, that much is true, but it was in defense of my own life, and I am prepared to face whatever court will hear the matter, provided it is willing to hear the truth alongside the accusation." Holt was quiet for a long moment, and then, to Ira's surprise, he said, "I have heard that claim before, Blackwell, and not only from your own mouth 6 years past when the sheriff first investigated the matter. There were 2 other men who came forward after you fled, saying Vance had threatened them in similar fashion, drawing a weapon over debts they disputed. The case against you was never as clean as the Vance family claimed. I have been sent to bring you back for trial, not for hanging, and I believe, given what has come to light since, that a fair court would likely see the matter for what it was." "Two other witnesses," Ira said, disbelief plain in his voice. "I never knew." "You ran before the investigation was complete," Holt said, not unkindly. "You might have saved yourself 6 years of looking over your shoulder had you stayed to see it through." "He was 17 and terrified, and had just watched a man die by his own hand," Louisa interjected, stepping forward with her hand still resting on Ira's arm. "I do not think you can fault a boy that age for running from what looked in the moment like certain death by hanging." Holt studied her for a moment, taking in the details that marked her as blind, the careful way she oriented herself by sound and touch rather than sight, and something in his weathered face softened. "You would be the rancher I have heard about in town, the one who shot a man's hat off in the dark." "I am." "Well," Holt said, "I will say this. A man who is loved by a woman with that kind of grit is likely a better sort than the wanted notice would suggest. I am still obligated to bring you back for trial, Blackwell, but I will speak on your behalf regarding the circumstances of your flight, and I believe, given the other witnesses who have come forward, that you have a fair chance of the court seeing this for what it was." The following weeks were among the hardest of Louisa's life. Ira was obligated to travel back to Missouri with Deputy Holt to face trial, and Louisa, though she wished desperately to accompany him, understood that the journey would be long and difficult, and that her presence at the ranch was needed to prevent Roan from taking advantage of Ira's absence. They said their goodbyes on a cold morning in late October, with frost silvering the grass and Louisa's hands cold around Ira's face, as she memorized the shape of him one more time before he rode away. "I will come back to you," Ira promised. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, I will find my way back to you, Louisa Keene. I love you too much to let anything, even the law, keep me from you forever." "I will be waiting," Louisa said, "and I will be practicing my aim in the meantime, in case Silas Roan gets any foolish ideas while you are gone." Ira laughed despite the weight of the moment, and kissed her once more before mounting his horse and riding away with Deputy Holt, and Louisa stood in the yard listening to the hoofbeats fade until she could hear them no more, and then she went inside and allowed herself exactly 1 hour of tears before squaring her shoulders and returning to the work of the ranch, because that was what her father had taught her, and what the past year and a half had taught her even more thoroughly. That grief and fear were luxuries a working rancher could not always afford to indulge for long. The trial, when it finally occurred in a Missouri courthouse in November, was shorter than Ira had feared and kinder than he had dared hope. The 2 witnesses Deputy Holt had mentioned came forward and testified to Cyrus Vance's pattern of violent behavior toward debtors, describing incidents remarkably similar to the confrontation that had led to his death, and the physical evidence, such as it was after 6 years, supported Ira's account that Vance had drawn his weapon first. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty, ruling the killing to have been in legitimate self-defense, and Ira Blackwell walked out of that Missouri courthouse a free man for the first time in 6 years, no longer needing to look over his shoulder at every unfamiliar face in every new town he passed through. He wired the news to Sweetwater before he had even fully processed his own relief. A telegram that read simply, "Acquitted, stop riding home, stop, tell Louisa stop," and the telegraph operator in Sweetwater, understanding the significance even from those few words, rode out to the Keene ranch himself to deliver the news rather than waiting for the regular mail run. Louisa wept when she heard the message read aloud to her, tears of relief this time rather than grief, and she spent the following days in a state of restless anticipation, counting the hours until Ira's return, listening for the sound of hoofbeats on the lane every time the wind shifted or a bird called from an unexpected direction. He returned on a bright, cold morning in mid-November, and Louisa heard his horse from half a mile off. Some instinct, or perhaps simply the accumulated familiarity of months spent learning the particular rhythm of his mount's gait, telling her it was him long before he came within normal hearing range. She was standing in the yard when he arrived, and she did not wait for him to dismount properly before she was moving toward the sound of him, and he swung down from his horse and caught her up in his arms, spinning her once in the cold autumn air while she laughed and cried at once. "I told you I would come back," Ira said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did," Louisa said. "And I told you I would be waiting." "The judge ruled it self-defense," Ira said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "I'm a free man, Louisa, truly free for the first time since I was 17 years old. I do not have to run anymore. I do not have to hide who I am or where I have been. I can stay here with you for as long as you will have me." "I will have you for the rest of my life, Ira Blackwell," Louisa said, "if you are willing to offer it." "I am," Ira said, and then, to Louisa's surprise, he was suddenly kneeling in the frosty grass of the yard, one of her hands held in both of his. "Louisa Keene, I have loved you since the second week I spent on this ranch, since you first hit that swinging can and I said your name and heard something in your voice that told me my life would never be the same again. I do not have much to offer you, no fortune, no fine house, only a willingness to work this land beside you for the rest of my days, and to love you with everything I have left to give after all these years of running. Will you marry me?" Louisa was laughing and crying at once, and she pulled him up from the frosty ground before he could take a chill kneeling there and kissed him soundly before answering. "Yes, Ira Blackwell, yes, 1,000 times yes. I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later, in the small church in Sweetwater, on a clear, cold December day with snow dusting the peaks of the Bighorns in the distance. The town turned out in surprising numbers, the story of the blind rancher and the drifter who had taught her to shoot by sound alone having become something of a local legend by then. And Louisa wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and Ira wore a new suit purchased with the last of his traveling money. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in genuine, warm applause. Silas Roan did not attend the wedding, and in the months that followed, his campaign to acquire the Keene ranch quietly ceased, whether from the embarrassment of his failed rustling attempt or from a growing awareness that Louisa Keene, now Louisa Blackwell, was no longer a woman who could be pushed aside by mere pressure or intimidation. He eventually sold his own spread 2 years later and moved further west, and the Keene ranch, now under the joint stewardship of Louisa and Ira Blackwell, began to prosper in ways it had not since Thomas Keene's healthiest years. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as ranching life in the Wyoming territory rarely offered an easy road, but they faced each hardship together, and Louisa's skill with the rifle, honed over that first transformative summer and continued in the years after, became something of a point of pride for the whole ranch, a skill she eventually began teaching to others, including, in time, several young women in the Sweetwater community who had suffered their own losses and injuries, and who found in Louisa's example a proof that disability need not mean helplessness. In the spring of 1880, Louisa gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas after her father, a healthy boy with his father's sandy hair, and as it turned out when he grew old enough to show a preference, his mother's remarkable ear for music and sound, a trait that made him, in later years, one of the finest fiddle players in the county. 2 years after that came a daughter, Sarah, named for Ira's mother, and 3 years after Sarah came another son, Daniel, rounding out a family that filled the ranch house with laughter and noise in a way it had not known since before Thomas Keene's death. Ira never spoke much of his years of drifting after the trial concluded, preferring to focus on the life he was building rather than the years he had spent running from it. But he did, on occasion, tell his children the story of how he had met their mother, of the rooster nearly killed and the shot fired wide, and the slow, patient work of teaching a person to see the world through sound alone. And Louisa, for her part, never let her blindness define the limits of what she could accomplish, running the ranch alongside her husband with a competence that silenced any lingering doubts the Sweetwater community might have harbored about a blind woman's capacity for such work. The ranch grew over the years, the herd expanding well beyond the 11 head that had remained in that difficult spring of 1878, and the house itself grew too, additions built onto the original structure to accommodate the growing family, each addition a testament to the patient, steady love that had built this life from the wreckage of two people's difficult pasts. On summer evenings, when the work of the day was done and the children were tucked into their beds, Louisa and Ira would often sit together on the porch, much as they had in those early months of courtship, and Ira would describe the sunset to her in low, warm tones, the colors bleeding across the sky behind the mountains she could not see but could feel in the changing temperature of the evening air. And Louisa would listen not only to his words, but to the particular quality of his voice, the contentment in it, the peace that had settled over him in the years since his trial and their marriage, a peace that had been hard won, and was therefore all the more precious for the effort it had cost. Do you ever regret it? She asked him once, many years into their marriage, when their children were grown enough to be trusted with chores of their own, and the two of them had a rare quiet evening to themselves. Stopping here, that first day, taking on a blind woman's failing ranch instead of drifting on to somewhere easier. Ira considered the question seriously, as he considered most things Louisa asked him, and then he said, "I have thought about that day more times than I could count, Louisa, and I have never once found a version of my life that could have turned out better than the one I chose that morning, when I saw your rooster nearly meet its end. I was a man running from everything from my past, from any kind of permanence, and I did not even know I was starving for a home until I found one here with you. No, I do not regret it. I think that morning was the finest piece of luck I have ever stumbled into, though I suspect it was less luck and more the simple fact that some things are meant to happen, however unlikely they might seem at the time." "I think so too," Louisa said, and she reached for his hand in the gathering dark and found it waiting for hers as it always was, as it had been for all the years since that first frightened, hopeful shot fired into the smokehouse door, the shot that had, in its own strange way, called Ira Blackwell into her life, and set them both on the path toward this quiet, hard-won happiness. Their children grew up hearing the story, told and retold at family gatherings and Sunday dinners, of how their father had taught their mother to shoot by sound alone, how she had faced down rustlers in the dark with nothing but her ears and her courage to guide her, how their parents had found each other through hardship, and had built something lasting and true from the wreckage of a blind woman's failing ranch and a drifter's fugitive past. It became, in time, something of a local legend in Sweetwater, told to newcomers and visitors as an example of the particular kind of resilience the Wyoming territory demanded, and on occasion, rewarded, a story of injustice overcome, of a woman's disability meeting not pity but genuine partnership, of a man's troubled past redeemed through patient love and honest work. Louisa Keene Blackwell lived to see her children grown and married with children of their own, lived to see the ranch her father had built, and she had nearly lost become one of the most respected spreads in the county, lived, above all, to grow old beside the man who had taught her that blindness need not mean helplessness, that a person could learn to navigate the world through senses other than sight if only they had the patience and the courage to try, and that love, real love, did not require perfect vision to recognize its own truth, only a willing heart and the patience to listen for it. And Ira Blackwell, the drifter who had once believed himself unworthy of any lasting home, found in the Keene ranch and in Louisa's steady, unwavering love the very thing he had been searching for across all those years of running, though he had not known its name until he found it. Not merely a place to rest his head, but a true home, built not on the shifting sands of chance and circumstance, but on the solid ground of two people who had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, across years of hardship and joy alike, to stand beside each other, come what may. They grew old together on that ranch beneath the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, Louisa never regaining her sight but never again needing it in the way she once had, her world rich with sound and touch and the particular, irreplaceable texture of a life built with intention and love, and Ira never again feeling the need to run from anything, having found at last the one place and the one person worth staying for. Their story, the story of the drifter who taught the blind rancher to shoot by sound alone, and who in the teaching had found not merely a student but a partner, a wife, and a lifelong love, became a part of the fabric of that Wyoming valley, told and retold across the generations, a testament to the particular kind of love that grows not from perfect circumstances, but from the patient, deliberate choice to see, or to hear, the worth in another person, and to build something lasting from that recognition, against all the hardships the wild frontier could offer. And on quiet evenings, even decades later, long after Sela's roan had faded into memory, and the frontier itself had begun to change and settle into something less wild, the sound of a fiddle playing on the porch of the old Keene ranch house, played by a son who had inherited his mother's remarkable ear, would carry across the fields on the summer wind, and anyone passing on the road below might have paused to listen, and to wonder at the particular sweetness of that music, born, as all the best things in that valley seemed to be, from a love that had first taken root in the sound of a rifle shot fired true into the summer dark.